retired Foreign Service officer. And our guest speaker, of course, of this afternoon, Dr. Dinkel Gordon, will speak to us on the topic of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. Dr. Gordon, as is well known, is especially qualified to speak on this topic, not only because of his being the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, but also because he is the U.S. coordinator for the Alliance for Progress. Dr. Gordon is a former professor of government and economic relations of Harvard University. He has served for 5 years as ambassador to Brazil, and many of us are familiar with his writings pertaining to Latin America, especially his 1963 book on a New Deal for Latin America. We are anxious to hear what he has to say on this current and most important topic. Gentlemen, the Honorable Dr. Dinkel Gordon.
Thank you very much. I haven't got a prepared text, and I would like to know before I start how much total time we have, because I'd like to save a good fraction of it for questions and discussion.
Well, the total time, I guess, is an hour or so.
All right. Well, let me try to make a rather brief introduction so that we can really spend most of the time on dealing with the subtopics that you're most concerned about, because after all, the question of inter-American relations, what's happening in Latin America, what our hopes and fears may be, is a very large topic. And being a former professor, I unfortunately have a capacity for speaking at very great length, particularly about this favorite subject. Let me say a word about my view of the state of Latin America and what follows from that so far as inter-American relations are concerned. I hate particularly in a scholarly and academic group to generalize, because one of the worst things that happens in the American view of Latin America as it appears in the popular press and magazines and sometimes in radio and television broadcasts is a grossly oversimplified one. But one has to generalize in order to communicate at all, and with all kinds of footnote reservations that what I say is not true about all countries at all times, let me oversimplify and generalize. About inter-American relations and about the development of Latin America, there was, as you know, a sort of euphoric period after Latin American independence in the early part of the last century, because it was felt that here all of these former Spanish and Portuguese colonies followed the example of the United States, won their independence from the mother countries, had adopted constitutions more or less copied after the American Constitution, and now everything was going to develop in harmony, both north and south, with a lot of collaboration, either in the extreme forms that were hoped for by Simón Bolívar or perhaps in looser forms. And this happy dream expired quite rapidly. Expired both for internal and external reasons. And there developed in Latin America, by and large, with some exceptions, a rather rigid social structure, dominated by and large by landowning oligarchies, with associated military and ecclesiastical hierarchies, which also unfortunately split apart as far as Spanish America was concerned into many smaller nations. Even the Central American Confederation experiment dissolved after about 20 years of vain efforts. And as far as the international side was concerned, there developed, of course, a great deal of passion and tension over the Mexican War in the late 40s. And then in the latter half of the century, a remarkable outdistancing in terms of economic development, social and political progress, and outdistancing of Latin America by the United States. Occasional efforts at collaboration, the founding of the predecessor of the Pan American Union, 1890, was one symbol of that. Some collaboration, especially with Brazil, which had a quite advanced diplomacy and foreign service, developed under the old empire and maintained by the Republic, but by and large, more falling apart than coming together. Then our own imperialist period, the turn of the century, the Spanish War, the Panama Canal episode, a good deal of business imperialism with investments more of an exploitative than of a character than of the character of participating in permanent local development. The rather significant numbers of interventions in the Caribbean and Central America. And then, of course, a sudden and rather dramatic change after the other period of tension started by the Mexican Revolution and when Franklin Roosevelt started the good neighbor policy in the mid-30s. Great deal of interest in Latin America then, governmentally. Nelson Rockefeller organized the so-called Inter-American Institute for the Institute for Inter-American Relations. A lot of what we now call Point 4 type technical assistance was started in the very late 30s. And during the war, except for Argentina, which favored the losing side up until about a week of the German armistice, active collaboration, political, economic, security, and of course in the Brazilian case, very active because the Brazilians sent a division to fight in Italy as part of Mark Clark's Fifth Army, several air squadrons, Navy participation, and so on. After the war, unfortunately in my view, a period of neglect on our part, which was a bipartisan responsibility. It was equally true of the Truman administration and of the Eisenhower administration up until the late 50s. I was working myself in Washington during the early part of that period, 1947, on the Marshall Plan, and I remember my predecessor, Eddie Miller, protesting occasionally in staff meetings and saying, well, sure, Europe is fine, but don't forget entirely about us. But the fact is that the dominant spirit in Washington then was that Europe's problems were so urgent, so pressing, and the dangers there were so acute that neither resources, energy, time, or thought could be spared for Latin America. This was a mistake, I think, in many ways, psychologically, politically, and otherwise, a rather costly mistake. But a mistake which began to be rectified in the late 50s, largely because of the influence of Douglas Dillon, then Undersecretary of State in the Department of State, and of course under the impact of such episodes as the attacks on Nixon in Peru and Venezuela, and the coming into power in Cuba of Fidel Castro. And what had begun as a gradual shift of policy was then pushed very much further by President Kennedy with the Alliance for Progress. So much on the inter-American side. To come back now to what was happening in Latin America all these times, this varies a lot from country to country, but by and large, with some exceptions, and Mexico is a very important exception, this rather oligarchical social structure dominated by small numbers of landowners began, in my view of the picture, to lose its force in the late 19th century under the impact of various liberalizing ideas which came from Europe or ideas which came from this country. You see this very clearly in the Brazilian case with the abolition of slavery peacefully in 1888, with the replacement of the empire, which was a rather moderate constitutional empire, in 1889, by a republic, with the influence in those times of positivist ideas symbolized by putting the phrase order and progress into the national flag, which is still there, and partly by some of the innovations introduced by the second emperor of Brazil, Peter II, during his very long term. The gradual growth of some industry, of some urban middle classes, partly in national bureaucracies, partly in private life, A process which you can see visibly if you trace the intellectual history or the political history going on in a gentle but significant fashion through the end of the century in the 1910s, accelerated some by the First World War, and in the 20s, and then suddenly and rather abruptly, very much accelerated by the Great Depression. The Great Depression, years 1929, 1930, are really turning points in the political, economic, and social history of almost every country in Latin America. A lot of more or less democratic regimes gave way to dictatorships at that time, but more important, in my view, was that the political near monopoly of landed oligarchies by and large gave way at the same time. In Mexico, of course, that process had taken place violently as a result of the revolution in 1910. In other countries, it was not violent, but very, very marked. The process of industrialization was greatly accelerated by the Depression because the countries just didn't have any foreign exchange earnings from their traditional exports. Coffee prices collapsed, metal prices collapsed, where there simply weren't purchases. And in order to keep any economic activity going, there had to be some effort, serious efforts in some countries, especially the larger ones, at replacement of imports by domestic production. That in turn was further pushed forward by the Second World War itself, with a shipping shortage and the absence of available imports, the collapse of the European economy. And then since the war, pushed forward still further by deliberate policy and by continuing balance of payments problems. Now there's a widespread stereotype in this country. I see it quite often in newspapers, periodicals, occasional television programs, like a CBS documentary on Mexico that some of you may have seen a few months ago, which I appeared briefly as a strong dissenting voice in the last 5 minutes. And occasionally in Congress, to the effect that virtually all of Latin America today is like Mexico before 1910, that it still has rigid social structures controlled by these landowning oligarchs, and really what's needed is a violent revolution, or a series of them, to overthrow this social order so that a new base can be fixed for more orderly development, more progress, more social justice. I think this is nonsense. I don't know any place in Latin America where the social structure today is remotely comparable to the rigidity of Mexico pre-1910. On the contrary, I think that all of the evidence is, it's more true of some countries than others, like all of these statements, but all of the evidence is that ever since 1930 there's been a remarkable period of social, economic, and political flux, with certain marked characteristics. Industrialization, which is quite substantial in Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, and is significant in the medium-sized countries like Venezuela, Peru, Chile, Colombia, and even incipient in Central America. Urbanization depends a little on your definition of what constitutes an urb, but by common definitions, which I think are 20 cities, concentrations of 20,000 and more, 50% of Latin America's population today is urban, and the proportion is rapidly increasing because the rate of growth of population in the towns and cities is twice what it is in the countryside. The average, as you know, is something over 3% a year. It's the highest rate of population growth in the world, of any large region in the world. But it runs between 5 and 6% in the cities, and in some of the big cities like Sao Paulo in Brazil, 7% or 7.5%. And in the countryside tends to be very low, 1 or 2% at the most. So that this proportion of 50 today is rapidly moving on up. And with urbanization come important political changes. Middle classes are developing. This is a hard thing to define and very hard to measure statistically, and requires a good deal more examination and research, but you can certainly see it by observation. You see it, of course, especially in the wealthier countries like Argentina and Uruguay and Chile, You certainly see it in Brazil, especially in southern Brazil, but even in urban northern Brazil. And of course you see it in Central America and Panama and on around the continent. And wider participation in politics by elements of the societies which 50 years ago scarcely participated at all. Literacy, the development of school systems, the overall figure for adult illiteracy in Latin America today is around 50%. And that sounds horrible, and it is horrible, but the other side of the coin is that adult literacy is also 50%. And if you compare this with the situation in Asia or in Africa, other underdeveloped regions, it's a comforting base. I don't mean to suggest that anybody should be satisfied with it, but it is a fact that although the educational structure is weak, both quantitatively and qualitatively, at least it's enough to provide a nucleus of modern type skills in almost every field that you can think of. Medicine, engineering, law. They've had too many lawyers ever since Latin American universities began, and some of them began before any of ours began. Sociology, administration. There is a nucleus of every type of skill required for modern development. More, again, in some places than others. And incidentally, practically none of what I'm saying is true of Haiti. But Haiti, however, is a gross exception to the whole Latin American scene. But it's so small that I don't want to confuse things by dwelling on it. Now, all of this, well, one other thing about income levels. Income levels average about $300 to $350 per capita. And this sounds very low. It is certainly low by our standard, which is somewhere between $2,500 and $3,000 per capita per year. On the other hand, again, compared with Africa or South Asia, it's quite high. There you have $80 to $100, Indonesia included. When I stress things like this nucleus of skills, I'm contrasting the Latin American scene with a situation like Indonesia, where the Dutch left the country 20 or 18 years ago with a few hundred high school graduates only in a nation of 80 million people, which is now 100 million people. You can imagine the problem of human resource development required to get, even if they hadn't had the nationalist craze of Sukarno further ruining their development for the last 15 years. It would have been a dreadfully difficult job. In Latin America, really, it's a much easier job, if tackled the right way. So I conclude from all of this that this notion that Latin America needs a Mexican-type revolution is entirely wrong. I also object on humanitarian grounds to the Mexican-type revolution. That killed 1 million people in Mexico when there was a total population there of 15 million. And I must say, any policy which is designed to encourage revolutions which kill off 1/16 or 1/15 of the populations of the country strikes me as a very unhumane and undesirable type policy, particularly if it's quite unnecessary. But the real thing that makes it unnecessary is the social mobility which has been introduced by these developments I've summarized, and by the very substantial base for development that exists. This is the situation which, in my mind, creates both the opportunity, the challenge, and the possibilities of success of the kinds of policies which are represented by the Alliance for Progress. What are the basic elements in this? What are the missing elements? What are the things which the Alliance is supposed to help bring about and to supply? Well, one of them is obviously more capital. And I would emphasize that it's more capital generated internally, even more than more capital generated externally. The external side is important. At Punta del Este, when we wrote the charter of the Alliance 5 years ago, we made some rough calculations, probably not awfully trustworthy, but the rough calculations were that Latin America required for its effective development about, if I get these figures right, it was $2 billion a year, about $10 billion a year of total investment, of which 8 should come from inside and $2 billion a year from outside. Those were the rough calculations of the time. And this, over 10 years, would be 100 billion, 20 billion from the outside. And our pledge was that we would supply something over half of this outside amount out of U.S. public resources, which we have been doing, something over $1 billion. And the rest was to come from the World Bank, the Inter-American Bank, private investment, and other friendly governments, Europe and Japan. If you look at what's actually happened in the last 5 years, as far as you can measure this, and the statistical data are pretty lousy, you find that domestic Latin investment, both public and private, has gone up from about 8.4 billion in 1961 to about 10.5 billion last year. That is a 25% increase in 4 years, which is a very good record. And the outside part has been net, at least, rather short of this 2 billion goal, particularly because private investment has been low. It's run about $1.5 billion. So in fact, at the present time, Latin America is supplying 85% of its own developmental capital and getting from the outside only about 15%. Well, this is one, mobilization of savings and capital and investment in the right things. Investment in the right things, the direction of investment, is just as important as the amount. This requires, obviously, coming to grips with the inflationary pressures, which have been a major bane of the economic development of almost all the South American countries. Not much in Mexico or Central America, not much in Venezuela because of the special circumstances of the oil industry, but everywhere else in South America. And acute in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia, pretty bad in Colombia and Peru. A very, very serious set of problems which tends to distort investment, ruin the functioning of the money and credit system, undermine incentives, discourage savings, and channel such savings as are made into the wrong kinds of investment. On the public side, it obviously means sensible planning of public investments with rational priorities. And on the private side, it means incentives and institutions that will encourage the productive types of investment, both in agriculture and in industry. This requires a lot of institutional development. I like to call it institutional modernization. And if I had to identify one key in this process, more than any other, I would rate institutional modernization as more important even than additional capital. Now, what do I mean by institutional modernization? Well, I could give many examples, but if you start with the governmental machine, at any level, national, state, where there are states, and local, I really mean a conversion of an ancient tradition that the reason to be in public office was to gain the simplest, the purest kinds of political gain. Some of you are familiar with a classical book of Harold Laswell called Politics, Who Gets What, When, Where. Well, politics in that sense, that is to say, getting money, either by corruption or just by stealing from the public treasury, getting the power to hire and fire, getting, in democratic or mock democratic systems, the authority to put thousands of people on the public payroll so that they and all of their friends and cousins will vote for you the next time elections come around. This kind of pure politics is very common in Latin America. It's the same kind that we have all experienced in our own national life in the political evolution of large city machines. And I can tell you that in Brazil alone, and I think in other countries too, that every political trick that any American machine city boss has ever known has been matched and outdone. The political savvy, I assure you, is not something on which technical assistance is required from the outside world. Now, these are past, present, and future masters. But the conversion of that concept of what government is about to the notion of government as an instrument for service to the public, for fulfilling needs of the collectivity or the community. This is happening. It happens. It requires a lot of changes in habits and attitudes, but it's visibly happening, and happening, I think, with surprising speed. One sees it at the local level, where the same kind of ancient tradition existed. And now through various efforts, particularly so-called community development efforts, and I think of such examples as the present Peruvian regime's concern with cooperación popular, popular cooperation, an endeavor for the first time in Peru's history, and its national history is 140 years, to do something to get the previously totally isolated and non-integrated Indian communities of the high plateau into some kind of organic relationship with the rest of Peruvian society. Something long overdue, but being seriously worked at, along with other things, such as the opening up of the eastern slope of the Andes so that these people can have some decent place to live. How the Incas ever managed to erect a civilization up on the Peruvian Altiplano, I must say, I find one of the most admirable mysteries of human history. It's a bleak, desolate, sterile, cold at night, inhospitable environment, and I suppose the only reason that they did it there was that they found they could defend themselves up there, and also in those days when they went down they got malaria, which has now been removed by technology. And this point of technology is another one I would stress. When people talk about having to follow the Mexican example, they forget that in the last 56 years that there has been a fabulous series of revolutions in science and technology and the common usage of those terms. That is applied to methods of production, communication, transportation, distribution, all this kind of thing, which is available for application in Latin America, a lot of which is being applied. And a not quite so remarkable, but as a kind of half economist, I like to believe a quite significant revolution in understanding of how one can guide and foster the processes of economic development. And on that point, to me, one of the most heartening things, and this is not entirely a result of the last 5 years, but it's evolved enormously, in this first 5 years of the Alliance for Progress, you find a concentration of political concern and interest and judgment of regimes in terms of their developmental effectiveness. If you look at the orientation of regime after regime today in Latin America, and political parties too, what is it that the Acción Democrática in Venezuela, or for that matter the Christian Socialists in Venezuela, who may win the next election there, basically they're after the same things. What is it that Frey is after in Chile? What is it that Belaunde is after in Peru? What is it indeed that Castelo Branco has been after in Brazil? What is it that a fellow like Julio Rivera is after in El Salvador? Or Diaz Ordaz and the PRI in Mexico? And you can find 9/10 of the answers in the Charter of Punta del Este. These are the kinds of things which regimes now in power, by and large, are mainly concerned with. That is to say, systematic economic development, reform of one type or another, modernization of institutions, greater social justice, and ultimately, I think, at least among the leadership groups in these various countries, a greater sense of self-confident position in the world. There is a feeling in Latin America, very widespread, you see this among intellectuals and political leaders alike, that somehow or other, although they are children of Europe, and even though there's a substantial admixture of Indian or Negro blood in many of the countries, nonetheless, the Indians and the Negroes that have married into and mixed into the civilization have become assimilated children of Europe. In Brazil, totally so, and in Mexico, 95% so. In Peru, still perhaps only 25% so, but the movement is all in that direction. They look at the other children of Europe. They look at Europe itself, the mother area, and they look at the other children of Europe, which is to say ourselves and Canada and Australia and New Zealand, and they see that somehow or other they've been terribly outdistanced, both in domestic development and in terms of being considered weights in the world. They envy this. They would like to do something about it. They ought to. I think they're perfectly right. They can. And the Alliance for Progress is designed to cooperate with them in helping to bring this about. I could talk at great length about what is going on in the way of self-help and reform, the way in which our aid, both financial and technical, is related to these efforts, the areas where there has been significant progress and the areas where progress has been disappointing. We have, but I won't do that because I've already talked long enough as an introduction. I will just say one word in conclusion about this notion of an Inter-American Summit meeting, presidential meeting, which is one of my principal concerns and subjects of current work. This idea was launched by the late President Ilya of Argentina in March, rather unexpectedly, and we discussed it in Washington early in April. We came to the conclusion that this is a point of rather like 1961 in a sense, where some new policy definitions can be very important. It's another one of these turning points or forks in the road, whatever you want to call it. And basically the point is this, that while there's been substantial progress and directions on the whole are good, the rates are simply not great enough. In economic terms, there has been achieved overall in Latin America in the last couple of years the minimum goal of the Charter of Punta del Este, which is 2.5% per capita increase. And by and large, it's better distributed than it used to be. There's been a lot of progress on all of the kinds of fronts that I've mentioned, but if you examine both the opportunities and the needs, and you can try to measure the needs in various ways, you rapidly come to the conclusion that substantially higher rates could be achieved, and that if for no other reason, simply in order to create jobs for the very rapidly growing labor force of Latin America, they have to be achieved. So President Johnson decided to endorse this idea, which he did vigorously in a speech in Mexico and even more vigorously in a speech on August 17. And it has now been agreed by all of the foreign ministers who met in New York a couple of weeks ago that this meeting will take place. The date's not fixed yet, but I think probably early in April. And that it should be serious. Unlike the Panama meeting of 10 years ago, which is the only other presidential meeting in Western Hemisphere history, that it should be directed at concrete decisions, but of a high political order, which warrants is worthy of presidential attention. We have identified 3 areas which we believe are especially worthy of concentration. I have no doubt that our Latin friends will have some other ideas too to add to ours. The 3 that we've identified are a real push on Latin American economic integration, a much more intensive attack on the problems of agricultural modernization in all respects, and the field of education. Not because other things like roads and power and industry and health and water supply and so on are not important, but because those things by and large are progressing pretty well. And these 3 areas that I have mentioned seem to us the ones which are lagging and in which more effective, concentrated, collaborative effort might make a great difference over the next 5 or 10 years. You can see from the tone of this exposition that I take on the whole a rather optimistic view of where we stand and of the possibilities of the future. I don't want to give the impression of being a Pollyanna about it. A lot of people have asked me, somebody asked me in San Francisco today, lunch, how I felt about the Alliance for Progress in comparison with the great expectations that were set up in 1961 with President Kennedy's famous initial speech of March 13. My answer to that is that I think some of the rhetoric that was used back in 1961 by President Kennedy and others was probably overdone, but that basically the goals and the directions were properly stated. I never thought, I had been through the Marshall Plan from beginning to end. I never thought, as many people did, that you could have a Marshall Plan in Latin America that would transform the continent in 4 or 5 years in the way in which Europe really was transformed in 4 years, from 48 to 52. Perhaps because my expectations were more sober, I don't feel any sense of disillusionment whatsoever. But I do feel a very great sense of urgency. And I do have a very sober respect for the formidable character of many of the problems. The very large population increase in itself is a formidable problem, a very serious one, because in addition to the obvious huge needs for housing and food and schools and all of the other things that a rapidly growing population needs. And it is rapid, 3.2% a year means a doubling in 22 years. There are 200 million Latin Americans today, and roughly 210 North Americans, that is Canadians and the United States. The estimates are that by the year 2000 there will be 1 billion people in the Western Hemisphere, of whom 650 million will be Latin Americans and 350 Anglo-Americans. Year 2000 to me seems a very long way off, but I'm sure to most of you it doesn't seem very far off. You ought all to live to see it, and that's one generation. That isn't very far off. But in addition to that, it creates the problem of a very young, a skewed age structure, a very young population. Half the Latins are under 19. Tremendous wave of people coming into the labor force, and a much lower proportion of people in the productive age groups who are available to do the work and the savings and generate the capital required to take care of this developmental surge. I'm perfectly well aware of the problems of rural backwardness and isolation, very well aware of the problems of the city slums, and they're large and serious. I know a lot about the vested interests who don't like the notion of change and will be carried along by it quite reluctantly. And this is true in the academic world in Latin America with respect to university reform, just as it's true of landowners who don't like land reform. But I see nothing static or impossible about this kind of task, tackled in the way that I've suggested, with the right kind of effort inside and the right kind of collaboration and support from the outside. Well, that's my story. I hope that's an adequate introduction.
Any questions, comments? Laura?
Would you like some coffee?
Gordon, there's one.
Would you like some coffee?
That's sort of striking you didn't mention, and it was a major tenet of your predecessor, Thomas Paine, policy towards South America, and also a conflict that he had with President Kennedy over the recognition or non-recognition of military coups, especially when you were ambassador in Brazil during the coup. And I wonder that it seems the handling of your administration of the Argentine situation with late President Ilia is different than, let's say, the immediate recognition of Brazil. And I wonder if maybe, is there a comparison between the two, or did the administration learn, or was the Argentine example based on our immediate recognition of Brazil? And if that is so, then do we regret what we did in Brazil because of what has happened in Brazil?
Well, it's a very good set of questions. No, I didn't get into it, not because I have any reluctance to, but only because one can't cover everything at once. This is a difficult problem. This problem of what to do about military coups or authoritarian regimes generally in Latin America. The basic policy, and this has been true for a long time, was true under President Kennedy, was true under President Eisenhower, is true under President Johnson, is that our preference is for constitutional democratic regimes. And we not only believe that as a matter of unilateral policy, we're also committed to it in any number of OAS resolutions, and the Charter of Bogota itself, which talks about representative democracy as the basic norm, so to speak, for governments in the Western Hemisphere. Moreover, we believe, at least I believe, that as Winston Churchill was fond of saying, this is the least bad form of government, that it's really desirable. Sometimes it works very badly. And in much of Latin America, where this norm has been in existence for 140 years, of course, the record is terrible. I had some figures gotten up when I went before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for confirmation back in February or March, just as to what had happened in the last 30 or 35 years. And since 1930, as I recall it, there were 106 in 36 years. There were 106 unconstitutional changes of regime in Latin America. That's an average of 3 a year. I mean, that's a dreadful record. Obviously, it's not political stability. Statistically, there is a rather favorable trend. There were more in the 30s because of the impact of the Depression, I believe, as I suggested before, than there were in the 40s. There were more in the 40s than in the 50s. Indeed, in the 50s, there were a number of reverse ones. That is, dictatorial regimes thrown out. Argentina with Perón, and Venezuela with Pérez Jiménez, and Colombia with Rojas Pinilla. These were, and some in Central America too. And in the 60s are only 2/3 gone, but the numbers have still been less. The Kennedy administration confronted this problem on a number of occasions. The first one was also in Argentina when President Frondizi was thrown out. The second was in Peru when the army didn't like the election results and they threw out President Prado and called off that election in effect. Those both happened in 62. Then in 63, before President Kennedy was shot, there were both the Honduran and Dominican Republic cases. In the Argentine case, the Kennedy administration thought about it. I was, of course, in Brazil at that time and not following the thing too closely, but I subsequently studied the history because it's obviously relevant to problems I now have to deal with. And I used to get back 4 or 5 times a year anyway, and my then predecessor, Ed Martin, who's our present ambassador in Argentina, is one of my oldest and closest friends, so we used to talk about this problem. Indeed, I happened to be in Washington when both the Dominican and the Honduran coups took place, so I sort of lived through that pair with Ed Martin. In the Argentine case, the Kennedy administration thought about it for a while, and they decided that obviously it wasn't going to be reversed, and there was a tenuous shadow of legality about Guido's swearing in because he was the vice president and he was sworn in by the Chief Justice, and they decided in about 18 days to recognize. That was done in the Peruvian case, which was the dramatic one, which is often cited as a model of how to do business. There was a violent reaction here, in Washington. The coup was denounced, the ambassador was withdrawn, the aid mission was withdrawn, the military assistance and training mission was withdrawn. We sort of shut down and said this was a dreadful thing. We wished it could be reversed, and in any case we would have nothing to do with this regime. Quite a long period went by. I think it was about 8 weeks. And it is true that during the course of that 8 weeks, partly as a result of indirect negotiations, because we couldn't have any direct ones, we weren't there, the new regime undertook to hold new national elections a year later and to accept the results of them. And after that was done and a few other negotiations, we did restore diplomatic relations. And in fact, the elections did take place on schedule, and Belloni got elected and was there, and that's fine. In the Honduran and Dominican cases, we did our best to prevent the Honduran one. We knew it was coming. It was foreshadowed. There were a lot of threats and warnings of it. We did our best to discourage the military there from doing it. We didn't succeed. Our influence in these matters is not unlimited by any means. We recognized fairly soon in the Honduran case, again, there was some sort of pledge about eventual elections and restoration of democratic institutions. In the Dominican case, President Kennedy was shot before recognition, but we know that there was lying on his desk at the time of his assassination a decision to recognize, and I think it's quite clear that he was about to and would have within a few days. And in fact, President Johnson did early in December, but it was perfectly consistent with Kennedy's policy. Now, during that period, I think this was about September, October 63, if you look back over the record, you'll find what has become a very famous letter written by Assistant Secretary Martin to the New York Herald Tribune on this subject. That letter created a great deal of controversy. He was criticized from both sides. I mean, for being too friendly to dictatorships and being too unfriendly to coups and too friendly to coups. Every type of criticism you can imagine, an experience which I've had subsequently. That letter, I know from Martin, was reviewed carefully by President Kennedy 3 times in 3 successive drafts, each later draft incorporating his suggestions on the earlier one, and the final draft having his explicit approval. And you'll find there, basically, a statement of policy that of course we want to use our influence in favor of representative democracy, but that We don't believe that a policy of indefinite non-recognition, the Venezuelan type policy, they have a very simple policy. They say if there's a coup, they won't recognize until after there's been an election and a proper constitutional government. That would be, we all believe, and President Kennedy believed that just as much as President Johnson does, and I do, that would be a most counterproductive kind of policy for the United States. And indeed, many high Venezuelan officials admit that it's a luxury, which, as they say, they can afford, but a larger country with a more elaborate set of relationships couldn't. For one thing, if you cut off relations, you then lose your channels of influence. Indeed, people who think that we made a mistake in cutting off relations with Cuba make this very point. And we did that, as you know, only under very great provocation. During the course of the year 1960, poor Phil Bonsall, our last ambassador there, went through sheer hell trying to find a basis for maintaining relations, and finally in January 1961, before Kennedy came in, but Fidel said, no, you can only have 6 people in the embassy, and it was obviously, in effect, a request for cutting off relations, and the Eisenhower administration acted accordingly. You lose your influence. Another point, and this is true of a case like Paraguay, generally people describe General Stroessner as a dictator. And it's a fair enough description, but it isn't a regime. It's very different from the Trujillo regime or the Rojas Pinilla regime in Colombia, or the Perez Jimenez regime in Venezuela, because this is not simply a sort of caudillo type who is sitting on top of this thing really for his own interests. Stroessner's a very serious man who came into office after 10 years of the most awful political chaos in Paraguay.